Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti from anthonymorganti.com. This is episode 24 of the video series where I critique and process your image. In this episode, we're taking a look at this image from Sikey. Now, I apologize, I know I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, but as far as the image itself, it's been my experience that a scene like this is the most difficult to photograph. And I'm not talking about the long exposure. I'm talking about a scene whenever you have cliff walls on either side of you. And what happens when you have these cliff walls on either side of you, usually the sun isn't right behind you or it's not right in front of you. It's usually off to one of the sides. And you're really taxing the technology of your camera because when the sun is coming in from the side, you're going to have one cliff wall, that's going to be bright, and another one that's going to be more dark. And it really taxes the dynamic range of your camera. And it's really hard to get a visually pleasing image when you have one real bright, side and one real dark side. Now, in this case, it isn't as bad. I think the scene, probably was a little more overcast this day, but it's still difficult to do. Preferably, I'd probably prefer the sun was right behind me. It will flatten the image because you're going to have flat lighting on everything, but it's easier to capture and it's easier to process. If the sun's a little bit in front of me, that would be a little more interesting light and it would be still kind of difficult to capture, but I think it would be better than when the sun's at either side. And that's where I really have a problem. And I've really never taken a satisfactory picture in my career when I'm down like in a valley or in a gully or in a, like something like this where you have the walls on either side. Now, the main issue you'll have too when you're really taxing the dynamic range of your camera is that parts of the image may get blown out. And in this case with this image, as you look at it, if I go to the histogram and I hover over this triangle on the right hand side, you'll see I get that big red blotch up there at the top in the sky. That is clipping, obviously. And when it's clipping, in this case, there's no detail there at all. There's nothing I could do in Lightroom. I could turn exposure all the way down and it's just going to turn gray. Nothing's going to be there. I won't get any cloud detail, nothing. So that's an issue. You really don't want a big swath of your image to just have no detail at all. It's been my experience that if you're photographing a scene that has very wide dynamic range, that means it has elements in that scene that are super bright and others that are very dark. It's best to expose for the very bright parts. And what I mean by that is, in this case, let's say we're here, and let's forget about for a second that we're using an ND filter, I believe, to get this 8-second exposure. But let's just assume we're taking a normal image. What I would do is I would put my camera in spot metering mode, and I would meter right at the brightest part of the scene right here. And let's, for the sake of argument, say that I meter it and it says it's 1/1000th of a second at f8 ISO 100. Then I would I'd set my camera to manual and dial those settings in. Then I would compose and take the image. What will happen is the walls will be super dark. The part of the sky up here will be perfectly exposed. The waterfall, as you can see if I hover over the histogram, you see parts of the waterfall were clipping as well. So those would be perfectly exposed. The problem is, though, still you have now these cliff walls will be very, very dark. But the way camera sensors are today, a camera will hold detail in the shadows a lot longer than it will hold details in the highlights. Meaning, you could go and underexpose an image by several stops and still go into Lightroom and be able to tease out all kinds of detail in the shadows. Whereas you may only blow out the sky by 1 or 2 stops and you won't be able to get it back. It's nothing you would do will allow it to come back. So in my opinion, it's better to underexpose the scene. So expose for the highlights, expose up here for the sky, and then tease the detail out from everywhere else that's really dark. The bad part about that is you're going to have a lot of noise in the shadows. The way the sensors are, it's just wherever the darker parts of the scene are will have more noise than the brighter parts of the scene. So you're going to have to deal with noise. In my opinion, still, I think that's a better alternative than having a large part of the image blown out. Okay, so it's kind of a creative decision though you have to make when you're taking the shot. Now, with that said, we're going to process this image as is. There's not much other, I could do with, with it now. Now, as far as the camera settings, I'm assuming that Sikey used a neutral density filter to get that 8-second exposure. They were at f18 ISO 100. Now, I mentioned every video. For a landscape image, you really don't want to stop down that much. Now, I know that Sikey probably stopped down to f18 so they could get that 8-second exposure. My recommendation is if you had more than one ND filter, if you had a ND filter that was heavier, more, darker, use the darker ND filter or sandwich some ND filters together so that you could get that longer 8-second exposure but still be down around f8, f11. And then I think, like if I zoom in, if you look at these rocks, like nothing is super sharp. Now, we could look at trees, but it was an 8-second exposure, and I'm sure that the wind moved these trees slightly, so that's not a good reference. But the rocks are a good reference. They're not moving. And you can see they're just not sharp. Nothing is super, super sharp. Now, it's acceptable, and we're going to make a decent image out of this, I think, once we process it. But I'm talking about creating a stunning image, something that you could blow up, 16 by 24, hang it on the wall, and someone could stand with their nose touching it and say, oh my gosh, that is gorgeous, all right? So that's what I'm talking about. So uh, I prefer that you used a heavier ND filter or a darker ND filter, and we're at f8, f11, somewhere in there, and I think you would have had a better image. Now, that said, the composition's fine. Like I wouldn't have set your camera any different way. You did fine. So I think we're just going to process this in Lightroom. I don't think we need any plugin for anything here. There's not a lot of noise because it's properly exposed. There's not a lot of noise, so I'm not going to send it over to Topaz Denoise. We could do all this in Lightroom, and I think we'll make a decent image out of this. So what we're going to do, we're going to go to the basic panel. Well, actually, lens corrections first. That's what I usually do, and then I'll go up to the basic panel. Now, what I'm going to do, well, first of all, the white balance is fine. Nothing to do with the white. I'm not going to change that at all. But I am going to go to exposure, which I rarely do. And I'm going to bring exposure down. Now, I'm bringing exposure down quite a bit because I want to, what I'm looking at when I'm bringing exposure down is I'm looking at the waterfall. To me, the most important part of this image is this waterfall and the water in here. And I want to just try to make sure that I'm not going to lose any detail by doing all these sliders I move around. So I'm going to bring exposure down right away. And just look at that waterfall and keep looking at it till I see detail I like right about there and in here, that it looks, looks good. It looks nice. So I like that. Now we're real dark otherwise, but we're going to fix that. We'll go to shadows and we'll open up shadows. Okay, so we have shadows opened up. Now, obviously, we're not going to turn highlights up because we're blown out up there. So we're going to just bring highlights down to about there. I'm just eyeballing it just to taste. I'm going to turn vibrance up a little bit to maybe 8. I'm not going to add any saturation at all. We're going to go to the tone curve to add contrast. Medium contrast is okay. Strong contrast is good too. I like strong contrast in here, but I think we'll go with medium right now because we're going to add some clarity and that will add some more contrast to it. I'm going to get a quick white point before I do that though by holding in the shift key and double clicking on the word whites, and the same thing for blacks, and that looks pretty decent right there. All right, so far so good. Now I'm going to add some clarity, and I'm going to add quite a bit. Probably more than I normally would prefer to add. I just want to make sure that not really introducing a lot of noise, or I'm not, getting artifacts introduced because I'm really pushing, the sliders a little bit too far. But that looks pretty good. Now, before I go on, I'm going to adjust the greenery. I want to get more depth, so I want more yellows to be a little brighter and the greens maybe to be even a little brighter too. But before I do that, I want to talk about something here. You can see the sun's probably up over here somewhere and it's shooting down this way. You can see these light beams a little bit. I don't think there's anything I could do to enhance those light beams. That would be interesting if I could, but I'm pretty sure I won't be able to do. But if you could see, now this looks like haze in here. I don't really think it's haze though. I think it's mist from the waterfall. And I know a lot of you are using Lightroom 5 and you don't have the dehaze filter in Lightroom that's available in Lightroom 6 and Lightroom CC. Tell you the truth, I'm not a big fan of the dehaze filter. It's down here in effects and it's down here at the bottom, and I never really, I just don't like it. So I don't really use it much. Now, if you have Lightroom CC, there's a dehaze filter in the brush tool and the graduated filter and stuff too. Actually, I think it works better in the tools than it does down in the effects panel. But I want to show you just how to deal with haze without using the dehaze filter. So I'm going to reset the brush and I'm going to double click on effect. Now this again isn't haze, so I'm not really going to be able to get rid of it because it's really, I think, mist from the waterfall. But, and I've covered this in other videos, you really could get rid of it with contrast. So we're going to turn contrast up. I'm going to have flow and density all the way up. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to paint in some contrast. Now what I'll usually do, you can see it didn't really affect it in here, but it did, in my opinion, it made it look better. There's before and there's after. But you could see there's kind of, even though I have feathering all the way up, you could see that there's a distinct kind of line where my brush was. Can you see that? So what I'll usually do is if I hover over there, you'll see everywhere in red is where I painted. What I'll do now is I'll get a second brush and I'll leave the contrast where it was, and then I'll take flow down to around 50. And where that brush is, I want to go outside of that and just kind of feather it. It helps blend it in a little better, in my opinion. And if you want, you could put a third one, I'm not going to, and put flow even lower, like around 20-25. And it will help blend it in to the surroundings a little better. So I like that. To me, that's fine. That brought out a little more detail in the waterfall, and it did cut through the mist a little bit to make it look a little more I don't know, a little richer, let's say. I think richer in color, richer in contrast, and I think it looks better because of that. Now, the other thing I like to do, I'm going to get another new brush by double clicking on new, and I'm going to reset the contrast back to 0. I'm going to turn exposure up a bit, and I'm going to put flow back up at 100. And another thing I like to do whenever I have white water like this from a long exposure, I just like to whiten it a little more sometimes. It just like adds a little more pizzazz to the shot. And it now as you look at it now, you might say, ooh, but actually trust me on this, it does work well. And it's you can be sloppy with it. And then that's a little too bright. I'm just gonna bring it down just a little bit. Okay, I like that. So here's before our brushes, after our brushes. Okay, maybe still a little bit harsh in here, but I'm going to leave it for now. I think no one will know. We noticed it because I did it, but I don't think anyone else will notice it. So I'm done with the brush, and I think I'm going to go down to the HSL panel, and I'm going to go to luminance, and I want the greens brighter and the yellows brighter. So I'm going to go to the yellow tab on luminance, and I'm going to bring those all the way up. They're not doing a ton, and we're going to bring green up also. Make them just a little brighter. It adds a little more depth. We have darker parts and brighter parts now. And the light was dappled light. It was coming through the trees, and it more, I think, reflects the way the scene actually looked with this kind of dappled light coming through there. So I think having greens and yellows up. I'm not going to do anything, I don't think, with saturation, I don't think. Okay, now detail. There's not a lot of noise, barely any at all. I could barely see any. So I'm gonna just like at 30 looks good. Looks like there's a tiny cross right there too. I don't know if you've seen that. Okay, and sharpening. I'll look through here. Probably push sharpening pretty high on this image. 88. Say that looks pretty good right there. We're going to go to the effects, and I never like those lighter vignettes, but I'm going to put a darker vignette on, and I mentioned this before if you've not seen previous videos of mine. A vignette, just a light vignette even, it helps pull people's attention more towards the center of the frame. And you don't want the brightest part of your image like on the outside of a frame like here, because they'll tend, usually when someone just looks at an image, they look at the brighter parts first. We want them to look at the waterfall and the water, and that's why I brighten those up, part of the reason. So we're just going to put a lighter vignette on, not too heavy. And I'd say that's it. I'm done. So there is before, and there is after. Before, after. Now, a lot of people like to add more vibrance and or saturation. If you did, you would just, crank it up. Personally, I don't like that, so I'm going to put that back. If you want vibrance up a little more, I think vibrance does a little better. There's no vibrance, and there's quite a bit of vibrance in my book, 22. I think that looks good. So that's it. That's our finished image. There's before and after, and that's it. So that's it. Thank you very much, Sikey, for sharing your image with us. And again, I apologize that I can't pronounce your name correctly. I hope that helped you guys and a little bit about sensors and focusing or exposing for the highlights and how that could be used to your advantage in certain scenes. And again, though, it's a really cool scene, really nice. The only thing I'd say, Sikey's, try to use a small or an aperture at a lower number. So it'd be a bigger aperture. So like, f8, f11, something like that. All right. Thank you, everyone that watches my videos. I truly do appreciate it. I'll talk to you guys soon.